So together I want to invite the panel. First, the chair of the panel, Professor Chezi Yeshurun, who is the father of computational neuroscience in Tel-Aviv University. So he will say no, but that's okay. Chezi Yeshurun, Professor Russell Poldrak from Stanford University, Professor Liad Mudrik from Tel-Aviv University, Professor Idan Segev from the Hebrew University, and Professor Jin-Yuan Lee from Stanford. Thank you very much and enjoy the meeting. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming here on this day. Thanks for the panel. So let's define the goal. The goal is that within 30 minutes, everybody will know what is the future of computational neuroscience, right? It's very important. So the first point I'd like to introduce is that we see a tendency to go from small boutique-like small samples, everybody's doing whatever they want, to very large repositories of data, potentially collaborating, big collaboration of many laboratories in order to get the big picture instead of multiple small pictures. What do you think about this tendency?
I think it really depends on the question that you want to answer, right? So for a lot of questions, you know, I think we're realizing, at least on the imaging side, that you really need very large samples in order to be able to, for example, ask questions about differences between people and how they relate to differences between brains. I think that, you know, fads happen, right? And right now, very large samples have, there's a tendency to think that all studies need huge samples, and I think that there are questions we can answer with very, you know, with a lot of data from one person, right? I think that the idea that you can collect a little bit of data from one person and say something about it, like everybody's moved beyond that. But I think that you don't necessarily have to have thousands of people to ask particular types of questions. It really depends on, and we've seen that, for example, in the recent imaging work that's done, you know, very dense sampling on single people. So it really comes down to what's the kind of question you're asking.
Yeah, and I should first say that from this panel, I'm the only one who's not a computational neuroscientist. So all my ideas about the future should be taken with a grain of salt, or with a sack of salt, maybe. I've been a part of an attempt to try and answer a question about consciousness using big data, not as big as everyone else, I think, here, but Gabriel Kreiman, who's also sitting here with me, is a part of this Cogitate consortium where we try to gather data from fMRI, MEG, and ECOG to arbitrate between theories of consciousness. So I've had the experience, the complicated experience of working with larger sample sizes in many labs. And I think that although it's highly challenging, for some questions, I think it is necessary. For some questions, I think it's only through team science that we will be able to make progress. But that doesn't mean, as Russ just said, that there are other questions that we can definitely study in the lab, and it will be much simpler. So having these big repositories, standardizing experiments across labs, this is a huge task that takes a lot of time and effort, and sometimes minimizes to some extent, or at least limits our creativity. What I can do in my own lab is very different than what I can do in that consortium. So I think it's definitely where the field is going, but I don't think that it will make our lab experiments, smaller ones, obsolete. I think that they will still be highly relevant.
There is a question regarding that. How far are we from defining protocols and formats such that everything could be fit into space immediately?
Yeah, so I must say that this was a completely new world for me, and I was struck by how complicated this is. So when I started my own lab, I said, yeah, I'm for open science. And so for every study that we did, we uploaded our data and so on and so forth. But uploading the data is nothing. You need to upload it in a way that everyone will be able to use, that they will be able to understand what's going on. It has to be standardized. So I think this would require a community effort, which has already been taking place with BEADS format and others. But this is definitely something that we as a community should work for.
So Idan, you were one of the pioneers of trying to do it in a very big way. What do you think about the issue?
Yes, first let me tell you that data is on its own doesn't tell you anything. You have to have theory or some concepts in order to take this data and analyze it in a way that will give you some answer to some question. Otherwise, it's just a deposit. And of course, I agree through this Human Brain Project that one of the key mission of this was to unify data at various levels. At each level, of course, there is different way from cells to proteins, networks, and imaging, and so forth. And this is very difficult, mostly because scientists refuse to play the role of unifying their data according to some standard. You know, each one is used to do what he or she likes to do, and this is a big shame for science, because without this unification, it will be a split science, and we are not going to understand the brain if each will try to look at it only from his or her point of view. But on the other hand, I want to say that I see some big jump in the use of the big data, at least in my field, and this is the EM data, electron microscope data. So about 10 or 12 years ago, people started to cut pieces of a brain of a mouse or of a human or of a fly at the level of synapses and connections. And physicists say this is a waste of time. It's zoology. It is zoology. You take many, many trees, you take a jungle, and you cut it to pieces, and you connect it, and so what? But the only real V answers on specific question in neuroscience, in my mind, came from EM. Huge data, petabyte of data, but specific questions that were theoretically had many possible answers, how directional selectivity is being computed in the retina, or head direction, things of that sort. There are many models. But only recently there is a V due to the big data, the EM. I see it a big change in that sense because I don't know any other V in any other field. A certain final answer came from this big data, the EM, the connectome, the connectomics. I see we can discuss it later, but...
Liad, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that another complexity, which is authorship and people. So when you work in big groups like that, universities at this point, correct me if I'm wrong, are not geared to rewarding people who are part of a big group. So if you're, you have been a part of a big effort to collect data and analyze data and make it public, then I think that we also, generally as an academia, need to think about how do we reward the individuals who've been a part of these large efforts, and how do we make sure that they can make progress because they are now sharing what they have done with the community. It's no longer I'm holding on to my data. Everyone can use it. But I'm a part of a big, many authorship paper, or many authors paper. So I think this is something that we should also take into account when thinking about the future of computational neuroscience.
They solve it in CERN, where a paper has thousands of authors in one paper.
Yeah.
So I think everyone agrees. But one thing I want to add is that neuroscience is now mature enough where there is a field where we can start to coordinate, but at the same time, it's early enough that standardizing everything at this point is a very dangerous thing. And so we should have a platform to allow both big and small science.
So in this regard, what do you think about the role of computational models in big data? For example, have you ever tried to to apply your model to someone else's data? That's a real question. Have you done that? Do you plan to do that?
Yes.
Great. So we have 1 point set. Mm-hmm.
I think ultimately everything that we can explain needs to be put into computation. We've spent a lot of time trying to gather data to kind of figure out what we're looking at, but now I think it is where everything is starting to integrate. In my own lab, where we've now transformed a lot of what we do into computational work, and we are now starting to test our results with data that we just see in publications, and that I think is definitely the way everything will be going.
Certainly, I'm only using data of others as a theoretician. And just to give you an example, now there is this new big project the cell census project, whereby people are trying to use different methods to characterize cell types in the brain. The reason is that we know that many of the diseases, brain diseases, are related to specific cell type. So it's not a mean field thing that every cell plays the same role, but apparently within the network there are subtypes of cells, inhibitory or excitatory, that when they go wrong, you see a disease or a function that disappears or appears just because you have a subcell type. So there is a huge project now, both genetic and morphological and electrophysiological. This is a huge data of many, many cells reconstructed with the patch seq, so individual genes are being extracted and you define the transcriptomic of this particular cell type. It's a huge, huge data. But in order to make sense of this huge, huge data of many, many, many cell types, let's say in the cortex, you have to have a modeling approach, classification approach, and so that's what we do. We take a data from many, many labs all over the world that put this deposit of cell types, and then characterize them and try to connect them to the network dynamics, but also to specific disease.
Do you think that it's time to revive or resurrect
Sorry?
big? Is it the time? Is the right time now to revive the idea of a big brain that combines everything in a model?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
The project, I mean, the big project.
Yeah, the big project of, you mean connecting, putting everything
in one brain, in one machine, or couple
you
of
mean
machines.
the blue brain, for example?
Of course, yeah. I was trying to refrain using this word, but
the word blue is very, very difficult. But these are blue chairs. You know? Again, it depends on the question you want to ask. Yes, for example, if I want to understand a question, let's say I take a column, a cortical column with a cubic millimeter. By the way, that's the size of reconstructions today of the EM. It's a cubic millimeter, which is about 100,000 cells in mammal, in rat and human a little bit less, about 1 billion synapses, 1 milliard synapses. So this is the scale of a simulation, but within this simulation there are many cell types. In the cortex, about 100 subtypes of cells. And if you want to understand, let's say, what happens to the dynamic of this 1 cubic millimeter due to the malfunction of this type of cell, unless you have some technique to biologically manipulate this subtype of cell, which we start to have, then you need this large-scale simulation where you can manipulate a synapse or a cell type or both cell types and so forth. So I don't see any other way but to simulate in details this particular circuit. And also, if in the end you want to cure this circuit, you need to have enough details in the simulation, a protein type, channel type, because after all, drugs are working on proteins. So you need it. I don't see any other way, really.
Yeah, Jean?
Alternative way.
I agree, but one thing I want to add is creating, just like my first comment, the fact that we don't know enough, it's very dangerous to decide what to go as like the big brain that we should reconstruct. One other thing I want to add is that I believe, I'm an electrical engineer by training, that the problem is not so much making a big brain, but actually figuring out what the smallest number of parameters to describe the brain is, and then start adding things as you go. And so starting with trying to make a big brain, I personally think is a mistake.
It's not a big brain, it's a big circuit. It's a detailed circuit. It's not the whole brain. I was involved, actually, I should tell you, about 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, I was in Corona and demonstration. And this 5 years ago, I was involved with this Allen Institute decision, what will be the next stage of what will be the next 10 years project, which is $1 billion for 10 years by Paul Allen. It was a very interesting discussion, but one of the people there insisted that the project for $1 billion, the most important project for the $1 billion, this is Svoboda. The most important is to cut one brain of one mouse completely at the EM level. This will give understanding of many, many aspects, and then they wrote beautiful paper with Larry Abbott, The Mind of the Mouse. It's a wonderful paper called The Mind of the Mouse, trying to push for one brain, full EM, which is we don't have even computers or clouds to handle such a large number data site. But that was the project he wanted, and he explained why, which was very interesting. Eventually, it was not supported by. Concept was one brain, full details. No, I didn't. I didn't, but that's what he wanted. He's now the head of the RNA.
So I don't have a model, so I could not do what you're asking, but I did borrow other people's models in order to understand better my data. So I think, generally speaking, for neuroscience, I always thought that this is one of the most interdisciplinary fields there is. So if you can collaborate with computer scientists, with philosophers, with psychologists, with physicists, with engineers, the phenomenon that we are looking at is so complex that we should probably borrow the expertise of many people. And so for us, it was a tool to make a theoretical claim. We had the data, we wanted to claim something about the data, we showed the results, but then we said, okay, let's use Aaron Sugar, in that case, computational model, in order to make a point about our data. And I think this is something that we should all try to do. It enriches your work and makes your claims way more substantiated. So.
One sort of orthogonal point to all of this. I mean, I agree that, formalizing models in math is a great thing, much better than just, saying I have a theory and it says blah. I worry about the approach that says, I'm going to take my theory and see if it fits to the data, and if it does, I'm going to tell a story about it. Because, for example, in the visual neuroscience, we're now learning that very different architectures can fit the data kind of equally well. And actually, it probably depends more on what the particular data are than the model, which one's going to win. And so I think having and that's another problem with this kind of idea of, like, sort of as Jim was saying, canalizing on one approach and saying we're going to take that approach and run with it, when it could well be that, you're really overfitting to one set of ideas, and you really want to take more of a kind of a model comparison approach and look across a broad range of models.
Yeah, it's like the mice in every lab behave exactly as the theory expects, right? So let's move on to the real question, which is ChatGPT and all this stuff. Last year, Galit and me, we had a seminar here, graduate seminar, regarding the relationship between AI, deep learning, and the real stuff, brain. And we played good cop and bad cop. I was a bad cop, of course, because I've seen that about 5 times, the rise and fall of everything, and I'm expecting the fall now. So the question for you is, what can we learn about the brain from the current deep learning and all around theories and systems?
Do you want me to be good cop or bad cop? Clearly the tools are super powerful for understanding data, and I think we've already started to get some insights, particularly like in the in vision about the visual system and what types of architectures might or might not support those sort of processes. I sort of feel like in terms of like what neuroscience can actually teach us about AI, it seems like the really interesting stuff is not like, what's the right architecture. It's really like, how does all this stuff happen on 20 watts or whatever it is that our brain uses, as opposed to however many million watts, GPT-4 needs to run and kind of occasionally do as well as humans on problems.
Yeah, and I think the same question pertains to experience. And GPT needs so many examples to learn from in order to do things that babies can do after a much shorter exposure. So I think we can definitely draw conclusions from one field to another. I found highly interesting the discussion about Noam Chomsky's theory, for example, about the role of nurture versus nature in language acquisition. Can we now use ChatGPT as some kind of evidence against the idea that we have to have some innate language knowledge? And I also found fascinating the counter arguments by Chomsky and others saying exactly that. Humans are not exposed to this. They do not require such a long training and such big data set in order to learn to do what GPT does. So I think that generally speaking, I think I'm curious to hear what is the fall that you are predicting. Because I think generally speaking, we need to be cautious in our interpretations of what this is and in the way, so we should be we should steer clear from making big conclusions based on analogies that might not turn out to be very well founded. But I'm curious to hear about, if I may, about the fall that you're predicting.
I think it's overhyped in the sense that basically what we've got here is everything that any person has written on any media in the last 10,000 years is available, and it's exactly like what Isaac Newton said, that he's standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, we have data. We see what other people say. We combine it. Some simpler example is just speller, autospeller. This is a highly scaled up autospeller. That's the whole thing. And my personal experience with that is that I have never seen anything really useful.
I mean, you know, you don't have to play with GPT-4 for very long to see that it's not a stochastic parrot, right? I mean, it's showing emergent behaviors that are really well beyond what you would expect based on the stochastic parrot caricature, and people are starting to understand those now in terms of you know, induction heads and things like the starting to understand how it is that particular architecture actually starts to induce kind of higher order behavior. So you know, I agree with your concern about being overhyped, but I think that it's clearly beyond you know, what the things that have led to the AI winters in the past. It seems like this might be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, it might be shorter winter, but yeah, the question is for that is let's have the typical example of 10 million monkeys just typing something randomly. As humans, we would find very useful patterns in that, and we can use that in order to continue it and do something else. So it's always a question of projecting. Do we project our own intelligence and understanding on completely meaningless information?
So at least that's what I feel today. I think first of all, it's a revolution. Clearly, we are in the middle of revolution. I think at a scale that we are not used to, this machine learning. But from the neuroscience point of view, I think we build a metaphor, these deep networks, Hinton's deep networks, with synapses inspired by brain synapses that can be manipulated. Doesn't matter that the algorithm not necessarily is the one brain is used, but still, synapses are manipulated in order to achieve a certain learning of a cup or of a face, of a letter A and so forth. Million of synapses, so it's a very distributed system. The units are neurons, so they have the 0, 1 and so forth. So it's a closer metaphor to the brain than any previous metaphor. So that's on its own is a progress to understand the brain. You take a brain, you simplify it and so forth, very simplify it, you know, only feed forward and all this kind, no inhibition, whatever, but it's a metaphor, which is, as you know, many scientists, maybe too many scientists are now moving from neuroscience to this metaphor to understand the metaphor which they build, but they don't completely understand the metaphor they build, which tells you something about our capability to understand distributed systems, but we can discuss it later. But anyway, that's the closest metaphor of our brain. We learn a lot about how this metaphor is working, and we can make use of it, at least in my case. I use this metaphor of deep neural networks to understand neurons in a way that I never understood before. So I have now a new tool, and I can ask systematically how deep is a single neuron with this metaphor. And now I have a matrix, a systematic matrix to compare the depth of different neurons, and depth means computational power and so forth. So it's an absolutely very useful metaphor to understand the brain. The fact that many physicists are moving more and more to understand this metaphor and a little bit leaving the brain, it's an issue that we can discuss, but it's certainly helpful in a way to understand the system that build the metaphor. Afterwards, the brain will build the metaphor, yes? And the metaphor helps you to understand a little bit of yourself, for sure, in my mind.
I have to say it's very refreshing to see so many bad cops here about ChatGPT. Because most of the time I go to engineering meetings, everyone's like, this is the future. But I'm more of a little bit of a bad cop. It's generative AI. It's by definition a liar. It creates lies. And so I think with this kind of technology in place, there is ever more need for critical thinking from scientists to really be able to discern the lies that it produces. At the same time, I am not as worried that this is necessarily going to be the way everything will go, because just as Russ mentioned, the energy that it consumes to generate that much information is really, really high. And so to really get at general AI, we need neuroscience more than ever, where you can actually create computational systems that are not built on von Neumann architectures, which have really high computational costs for intelligence type of computation. And so I think we should be cautioning about all the different potential issues with generative AI. At the same time, I think neuroscience will lead the future of real general AI.
Yeah, the problem with this panel is that it looks like they all understand exactly what the situation is. We need someone from Goldman Sachs here.
No, but I want to be the non-understanding one, or the good cop. I do think, and here I agree with Idan, that this is a revolution. And I think that this will change the way we behave in everyday. I'm not a prophet, but I think it will change the way we behave in everyday lives. It's already changing. For me personally, it does things that I never thought that it would do. I think it will change the way we teach. I think it will change the way we do research. I have a colleague who told me that he was trying to, he worked on a grant, so he asked GPT, I'm going to write a grant with scientist A and B. What ideas do you think we could work on together? And it gave him some interesting ideas, and that was the starting point. So this is something that is a new way, and it's just a small example. I think that we already hear about, prompt engineering and stuff like that. I think our children they already grow up in a world that is different than ours, but I think this is going to be a huge change. Maybe I'm Goldman Sachs here, but I think that the way it seems to me now, what things that I've seen this year make me think that things are going to change substantially.
Yeah, I completely agree, but it's not unlike having these 10 trillion monkeys, but working very, very fast.
So I want to point out another way in which actually I think these models have been super useful in psychology, which is as sort of an intuition pump, or if you want to think about them as like sort of model organisms. So people in psychology have been looking at the behavior of, GPT-3, GPT-4, and asking, does it show particular phenomena that humans show? For example, you can ask it to categorize things, and it shows phenomena that people have referred to as essentialism and categorization. Psychologists have always thought that, well, that means that, people have a theory. For example, when I ask you, is something a raccoon or a skunk, and you have a theory about what it means to be a raccoon or a skunk, GPT-3 even will behave in exactly the same way humans behave on those, adult humans behave on those problems. Does that mean GPT-3 has a theory of what it means to be a skunk or a raccoon? And so the reason that's interesting is psychologists have always thought that implied that we have a theory, but many of them refuse to agree that GPT-3 has a theory, even though the data, if you could be interviewing a human or a GPT-3 over the internet, it's the same behavior. So I think it's been a great kind of driver of renewed criticism, similarly around the sort of stuff around linguistics and innate knowledge and the need for kind of explicit linguistic rules. I think it's, apart from whether it's certainly like a transformer model is probably not a great theory of how the human mind works, but it's still been a really great model organism to kind of test the way that we theorize.
So let's finish with the most interesting question, mostly for you, Liad. Can we expect anytime soon or not soon a conscious machine?
So I had one of the things, I just came back from a sabbatical last week actually, so I'm still lightly jet-lagged. And one thing that I've done this year was to interact quite often with computer scientists and neuroscientists and philosophers around the question of developing a test for consciousness for different systems and specifically for AI. And I think a very interesting approach is accepting computationalism as a working assumption, saying if we will ever achieve consciousness in AI, and it's an ethical question if we want to do it, but people are already working on it, then the most promising way to do it is to rely on theories of consciousness that are based on humans and ask, what is the architecture that is needed, or what are the functions that are needed? And this is computational functionalism. So what functions should we implement in order to mimic the functions that go with consciousness in humans? Now, of course, the big question is, will we create a system that will behave as if it's conscious without actually having a phenomenal experience? Or will, if computational functionalism is true, then the system will actually have phenomenal experiences. Now, that's a big if. And this could be actually a case where we use AI in order to test computational functionalism. The greater if is, how would we know? And that's the thing that we've been kind of trying to wrap our heads around it, because it might behave like it is conscious, it might say that it is conscious, but does it feel the redness of red? Here our intuitions play a major role, but I would say only one thing about intuitions. Go back 100 years, people thought that women are not as conscious, and children are not as conscious, and animals, now we see a change in the way we think about animals. So our intuitions are only as good as the society and the values that we live in. So these are highly, highly complicated questions. So that was a very long answer saying, I don't know, basically. But we have to wait and see.
Well, it's certainly not my field, so what Liad says is much certainly more professional than mine, but I think, at least in my naive intuition, if you succeed to build synapse by synapse, neuron by neuron, in the same architecture, with plasticity and learning and interaction with the environment, in a different material, rather than biological, it will be, I don't know what, some VLSI, or I don't know what, some other material that will really replicate what we have in our brain. It's hard for me to see why not.
But it's a physical replication, or not a simulation.
No, physical.
No.
I'm
if
talking
we
about
simulate everything,
No.
then that's it.
No, I meant really to build it physically in, in deep networks, but, now the neuron will have dendrites and synapses will have this learning rule and whatever, and there will be protein-like devices. If I can really replicate,
then it would be exactly that.
I don't see why it will not be. So AI, in my mind, but maybe I missed something, and you need biology for that. There is some magic in biology. You need membrane to do this consciousness. I don't know, but I don't know why. But maybe you know. I don't know.
Jim.
I would argue that it's already conscious.
Oh, thanks.
Will be fired from Google.
Okay, maybe I shouldn't say that. But the fact that you make decisions on anything, I think, there is a lot of different definition of consciousness, but if you look at the consequence only in terms of how you interact with humans, etc., the fact that it already makes decisions makes it conscious in many forms of definition of consciousness. Yeah. So the short answer, yes.
Yeah. Russ?
Oh, boy. You have to tell me what consciousness is first, and then I'll tell you. No, I have a policy in general. If somebody asks me a question about consciousness, I refuse to answer it because I don't know what they're talking about. As a scientific concept, I know what they're talking about as an intuitive concept. So I want to hear as you're saying, what is the test? I don't know. I would disagree with Jen that GPT-4 or 3 or whatever is conscious by most definitions, but I don't know.
Yeah.
By suffering.
Suffering is a form of feedback system, and so if you have a feedback system that lets you make decisions, it's not conscious in the same way humans are, so it really depends on the definition.
Conscious in the way the thermostat in this room is.
Well, the thermostat is not necessarily making too many decisions, but...
It turns it on and on.
Good point. Yes, thermostat is conscious.
So we had 30 minutes. I hope we answered everything. We know where we are going. Thank you very much.